there is an education crisis in the world, which is much more pronounced in the developing countries.
How do we design the curriculum in a manner that it responds to the job market?
As parents and as communities, we have a responsibility to raise and educate our children.
Welcome to State of Africa. I'm George Ndirango. Let's pick up where we left off on the conversations held at the Africa Leadership Forum in Uganda. We turn our focus to a cornerstone of sustainable development, that's poverty eradication and economic growth. The African continent is determined to end poverty in all its forms, a commitment that aims to lift millions out of extreme poverty. To support this, different African countries are actively addressing hunger, ensuring food security, and advancing sustainable agriculture. A panel of experts joined our moderator, Dr. Julie Gishuru, President and CEO at the Africa Leadership and Dialogue Institute, to interrogate this a little further.
This is a crucial discussion for Africa. In the early 2000s in Kenya, when free primary education was declared, it was implemented. It was messy. There were lots of students in classes. For a few years, there was a lot of confusion, but it ended up sticking and it worked. And I think that was political will. And so maybe the first question I'll come to the panel with is, how do we address these numbers? And perhaps, to the education experts, we need to give ourselves the grace of saying it might need to be phased in terms of how we improve and improve. Or is there an example we can take as Africa from other parts of the world? What should we be doing? So let me start, Your Excellency, as a leader, with you and your experience in leadership. Your Excellency, Dr. Kikwete, how do we achieve this for Africa? What are the things we must do?
Having been involved on education matters for quite a while, I've been a member of the Commission on Financing Global Education. We worked for about 2 to 3 years. The conclusion was there is an education crisis in the world, which is much more pronounced in the developing countries. Its characteristics are: one, there are still too many boys and girls, children and young people who are supposed to be in school but are not in school. It's 240 million globally. When you take all the 6 continents, again, you can see the problem, how the situation on the continent. The second aspect of this was that even those who are in school, 33% in primary school, don't complete their education. Ambassador, if we were talking about 1 in 5, I think, it's about the same. So that's another problem, because we're not talking about 2 or 3%, but over 33%, it's a lot. And the third aspect, those who are in school, the learning outcomes are low, which means that they don't get the skills for that level of education. This is the general. Ambassador Sefu was much more in the details of every aspect. We spoke about the issues of access, the issues of quality, the issues of equity. But one important factor that was raised, which is now the preoccupation of us in the Global Partnership for Education, as I said, it's an institution established by the G7 21 years ago to promote quality education in the developing countries. I am the 3rd chair of the board in the 21 years. The first was an American, the second was an Australian, the former Prime Minister of Australia, and then the third is me. One day Gordon Brown called me, says there is this We are looking for a chair, and we think you can be the chair. So fine, if you have trust in me, then that's fine. It is the organization, it is organized, they established it, and they are paying for its budget. It's a huge budget, $5 billion, and the next replenishment is next year. We are looking for $15 billion. And it's among the developed countries that are contributing to that budget. But besides the developed countries contributing, we in the developing countries have also made a vow that we must, our children, they are not the children of donors. We also have to invest in our own children. So there was an understanding that each country on the African continent should set aside at least 20% of the national budget for education. But then we created a track for countries now to make your own contribution. The commitment was 20% of the national budget to be set aside for education. This is a compact. We asked countries to sign this compact, and only 20 countries signed. At that time, and we had appointed President Kenyatta to be the champion, to be champion, talk to his peers, and encourage them to contribute. Now you can see only 20%, only 20 countries signed the compact. After Kenyatta retired, we took Nana Akufo-Addo to be the champion. After Nana Akufo-Addo retired, we are now going to choose for another African leader to be the champion. But the work of the champion is to encourage countries to contribute 20% of their budgets for education. If there's anything that I would really emphasize, there is this compact of countries setting aside 20% of their national budgets for education. If there is a message that all of us should carry when we go back home, those who are in government should carry, there is this compact. Yeah. Please, we are contributing for our children and our children's children. For me, I have no child in school. I'm a grandfather now. I have 15 of them. So I'm contributing for my grandchildren. So that is what I could say to start with, that 20% of the national budget for education, if we can do that, I'm sure we will make a lot of progress with education in our respective countries.
To Charles Kimpolo, let me come to you now. When you look at the pathway forward, you're in it, this is your work. What are the crucial next steps we must take? How do we move forward?
The way forward, so the way I look at education is three components. First is access. Are we going to be a massification policy where we just give access to everyone? Is that the way to go? It's good to make it free, equitable, ensure that it's not excluding people. That one. The second one is quality. So what kind of student are we talking about? The teachers. Are we changing what we have been doing for generation? Someone said, I think it was Albert Einstein, which said that it is insane to continue doing the same thing over and over again and expect different results. I think your question is how do we move forward? One other component people have not been talking about education is relevance. Okay? For what? I think you made it very clear. The worship of degrees, marks, that's where past excellence in our time was you be top of a class 100%. I think the private sector is not looking at that. It's not good enough. Relevance of education. How do we design the curriculum in a manner that it responds to the job market? That's the job I've been doing at the African Institute of Mathematical Sciences, to really look at education from a supply perspective. Right? We're supplying the skills, we're supplying students, but people who are consuming the skills that we are supplying are from the other side. It's very important to bring everyone on the table so that we design curriculum that respond to the market needs, which is not fixed. Market need will never be fixed. with emerging technology, now we're talking about AI, it's going to continue to change. How are we going to make our education system agile, which is not a good word for politician, because being agile requires change of mindset, in a manner that we adjust to change, in a manner that we develop curriculum in a way that it really responds to the needs. So for me, relevance is one component that we're saying. And for us to do that is really to develop new partnership. Shouldn't we use technology to empower the teachers so that they can use AI to deploy the same content, to be at the center of curriculum delivery, to reach more people in a short time where we don't compromise quality? Shouldn't we bring the private sector? I like the fact that you're putting the budget of government at 20%. My role at AIMS have always been seeing the private sector creating their own academy. I think the reason they're doing that is because they don't trust anymore our education system and university. They're creating the academy because they acknowledge that the education system, university, or whatever you call it, are not preparing the graduate to the job that you have. I think maybe the conversation is to bring them on board to say, how can we adjust the curriculum in a way that it responds to your need, and we do it together so that you can bring some resources, so that we can do it together, because I think education should be a common purpose for everyone.
No, fantastic. Thank you for that. Let's give him a round of applause for that. What is quality education for Africa? We gathered 16 African ministers of education in Lagos, Nigeria, and we met to discuss these issues. And the discussion evolved from educational access to technology to what education for Africa. And we asked the question, think of a young man in northern Kenya, Turkana, sitting under a tree. A boy of 9 years old, a girl of 9 years old. What education do they need to be successful in their realities compared with those in urban settings? In Canada, there's some incredible work that the foundation I used to be with, the MasterCard Foundation, does with indigenous communities, where the indigenous communities refuse to take scholarships to go to the big universities in the cities. They said no. Many years ago, you came and took our native people, and we're digging mass graves now of children who died in missionary schools and in your school. So we're not leaving our land. Also, we honor our land and we believe in conservation, so we want to stay close to our land. So what happened was, an education system was built around the indigenous communities, where they decided what was important for them, how to clean the rivers, how to fish the salmon, how to bring back the populations, the herds of bulls, etc., 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 how to do that intricate sewing, traditional sewing. And the university that was created allowed grandmother to create a course where she was teaching grandchildren and others how to do traditional sewing. And the grandmother was paid for that. And that was to keep the traditions alive. Yesterday we talked about indigenous plants and herbs. And is Africa bold enough to look at her curriculum and ask, what are we teaching our young people? I keep asking teachers, why did I have to learn that a man called David Livingstone and a man called Henry Morton Stanley met somewhere on our shores of East Africa, and one said to the other, Dr. Livingstone, I presume. Why is that even in my head? Because I had to learn it in school. How many learned that? How many learned that? Nearly everybody in this room learned that, Dr. Livingstone. Why did we learn that? What business is it of ours? And so can we also start to recreate? So I've just injected that. I want us to come back to it, but let me come to the economist now and really ask your perspective on the whole issue, but also dive deeper for us into the question of funding and your thoughts on that.
Thank you. Let me start by defending history. I think history is very important for us to know, even if it may not have practical relevance in our day-to-day lives, especially if you're going to ask the question of the relevance of education in our societies. If we have no clue about where we're coming from, you can be sure we have no clue about where we're going. And maybe let me start from there. In my own perspective, the challenge with our continent as a whole, and education in particular, is a crisis of imagination. 60 years after independence, we are grappling with the same questions that our forefathers grappled with, attempted to resolve, made some headway, and today we are still trying to resolve those same challenges. Unfortunately for us, there seems to be a sort of dead end we have run into intellectually that we cannot seem to find our way through this fog of challenges. And so it's going to be of utmost importance for us to draw on new streams of thinking, bold, courageous thought that does not necessarily align itself perfectly with conventional thinking that has brought us where we are in the first place. And to be able to do that, it is important for us to realize as Africans in general that in fact we are at war. Being on a war footing requires that we do things in a very extraordinary manner. We cannot seek to build societies as if things are laissez-faire, as if things are normal, okay? We must engage our intellects, our minds in very critical, deep ways to be able to come up with new, unconventional ways of thinking about some of these challenges. Unless we recognize that we are under an existential threat, which in contemporary times is manifesting as rollbacks of donor budgets, the crisis of democracy in our continent having failed to deliver the prosperity that it promised, etc., etc. If we are unable to realize that we are facing an existential moment, we shall continue comfortably to think about our problems in the same ways we've done for so long without making any breakthrough. So in the realm of education, what might that look like? Number one, I think that the centralization of planning, development planning within the state at the national level needs to be rethought so that you give some autonomy to local levels, sub-regional levels to do some planning. That could help us with some of the funding challenges in the following ways. I get very heartbroken when I watch news here in Uganda. I'm from Uganda. And there is a distant place that is calling out the government to help them construct a pit latrine. And these are adults with children, but saying government should come and help us construct a pit latrine. You have like 1,000, 2,500 people, and all of them are just living carefree, waiting for government to come and build for them a pit latrine. Okay, let's take it away from a pit latrine and talk about a classroom. How on earth could you be adults, you have parented children, and you can dare complain that children are studying under trees, and it's not conducive, and suddenly you're waiting for government to come and build classrooms in those localities? With an environment that you're inhabiting that in fact has all the components you require to construct a basic classroom that can house students to study away from the vagaries of nature, okay? So if there is some decentralization in some of the implementation of development, and in particular education, we shall stop the infantilization of our people, thinking that central government must resolve everything for them, and they can start to take some responsibility. The second way it can help is integrating economies. With decentralization, I once read a story in Zimbabwe. I think the currency had collapsed, and now parents were paying for school fees using goats. The school term starts, you go with your 4 goats, you talk to the head teacher, you give the goats, they admit the child. When I was younger, it was a very funny story, and I used to tout my Zimbabwean friends about just how terrible things were in their country. But in hindsight, perhaps that sort of integration of local economies, where needs can be integrated. If you have a farming community that can produce what teachers need, the money they're going to need in compensation as wages can be driven down if part of that is subsidized by the economic value that is produced by the parents of kids in those localities. But that might only be possible if there is some sort of decentralization and decision making, and we are not waiting on the central government to bring the money, to construct the classrooms, to bring the chalk, to buy the desks, etc., etc. So there must be a shift away from this infantilization of our people in thinking that the state is going to do the thinking for them. So much so that they want classrooms to be built, desks to be constructed for them, toilets to be built for them by the central government. The other point I want to make is on the point of human resource, still related to funding. Where do we get the money to train all the teachers? We've talked about the fact that many kids are dropping out of school, and I wonder if there's a difference between dropping out and graduating. You know, at the end of the day, we're all going to be looking for what to do with ourselves. That may not necessarily have to do with what we learned in school. But you have this army of school leavers that could be trained through maybe some form of national service program that can go back in their communities and undertake facilitation of learning as volunteers, as pre-primary or primary school teachers. But they're roaming around the cities, being problems, raising our population growth rate, and contributing no economic value in the country because we have failed to engage them productively. So capitalizing on the army of school leavers we have who are desperately searching for jobs, part of that human resource can be leveraged, channeled into some of these working as volunteers to provide education for the younger ones that are still coming up, to plug the gaps in human resource, to plug the gaps in competence, etc., etc. Finally, the question of technology. I started by saying that we must recognize that we are on a war footing. And being on a war footing requires that we don't do things in normal ways, okay? I appreciate that the world is making tremendous progress technologically. 60% of our continent is rural. The internet penetration rate on this continent is less than 50%. So if you are going to put forth solutions like artificial intelligence, hello, 50% of us are not even connected on the internet, okay? That is not to say that we mustn't incorporate advanced technologies in our learning models, but to say that we must leverage them or innovate other ways that are well attuned, contextualized to the reality of our people. In some parts of this country and the continent at large, there's no telecom signal, okay? So how then are you going to propose artificial intelligence as a way of accelerating education progress? We don't even have the money for it in the first place. But the point I'm trying to demonstrate is not anything against technology or anything against seeking money from our development partners, but that we must engage the mind in critical ways that accord with the reality that we're inhabiting, recognizing that as a people, Africans, we're under an existential threat. If we do absolutely nothing about our situation, we might have no continent to speak of in a very long while. Part of being on a war footing is to train our young people to know that they're coming out of school, not to expect their societies to give things to them, but to expect them to make contributions to building their societies. That slight mindset shift will help us to even emphasize particular aspects of education that are going to best enable our young people to contribute to the transformation of our economies. Because ultimately, the funding challenges we have is because our economies are unable to produce sufficient economic value because they are technologically backward. If we're investing in science and technology, encouraging our young people to innovate, creating an enabling environment for them to be bold, audacious, and courageous in their thinking, then they come out thinking, how do I solve for the problems of my community? Not how does my community guarantee me a meal after educating me for 20 years.
We in Tanzania have been a German colony from 1884 to 2018 after World War I. And then we became part of the British Empire until 1961. With all these years of colonial rule, German, British, at independence, there were only 2 engineers. I want to make this clear because at times people say, you know, African leaders complaining, they are doing nothing. Look here. At independence, there were only 2 engineers. Bodeminja, and there is another one. Only 2. Today, we have over 15,000 engineers. It is an investment that was made after independence. There was no university in Tanzania. it was the party that was for independence that decided the headquarters that they had built for their party. It's because there was no university. And then President Nyerere said, let this be the nucleus of the university. So I want us to be cognizant of the fact that nothing has been done, please. A lot has been done. But we are now talking of the needs of the present. The needs of the present that we have now to move from here going forward.
By implementing policies that promote inclusive economic growth, job creation and entrepreneurship, countries across Africa are striving to reduce disparities in income and access to resources. Let's take a short break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to State of Africa. We turn our attention to an important conversation featuring Jean-Marie Ishimwe, the East Africa Regional Lead for Refugees Seeking Equal Access at the Table, also known as RSEAT. In East Africa alone, more than 3 million people are currently displaced due to conflict, persecution, and environmental challenges. This region is home to the largest refugee population on the continent, and efforts to ensure their voices are heard within decision-making processes have never been more critical. We've been having a lot of conversations. You've been part of the Africa Leadership and Dialogue Institute convenings with at least some of the refugees, and you've engaged with RLOs. Your knowledge on what's happening on this other side of the ecosystem is deep, and I need to tap into that brain for a second. When we are mapping out leadership, for example, at a convening like this, it's very likely that some of those voices get lost. Going by what you've seen the last few days at the Leadership Forum, do you think they're represented well enough, or where do you see some of the gaps?
Well, man, first, thank you very much for having me. I think certainly the refugee voices continues to be an invisible voice that is too powerful to be invisible. Refugees have voices in the communities, but unfortunately, it comes to high-level meetings, big meetings, the voices are suppressed. Okay. The suppression is not really someone suppressing, but really a question of access and a question of the recognition of their voices. As you rightly said here at the Africa Leadership Forum, I think I see a lot of intentionality for inclusion of various voices, marginalized to say, but I think the refugee voice is a little bit still a bit not the level where would need to have. I mean, I asked the question in one of the sessions about what is the economic value for Africa to, rethink how refugees contribute to their societies and not to think about foreign support as the only way around. And I think that if you think about that question more deeply, it's a question of has our African state, and especially now within this dispensation of where we have uncertain times, funding cuts, talked to the people that the solutions we are trying to build are supposed to assist them.
Allow me to put a pause there, because you've said some very crucial points. Just paint a picture for us on just how much contribution, whether economically, socioeconomically, that refugee population contributes to the region.
Yes. No, I think I would put it on different strands maybe. I think economically there's a lot of viability for both the skills that they have, but also for what could be revenue in terms of systemically if they're included within the tax or economic fabric within our countries. So economically there's a big viability for that, and I think we need to see the value of that. As is socially, I mean, if you think about some of the regions or areas where refugees settle, most of those communities really appreciate to stay together with those refugees. And I think this idea of working with host communities and refugees can bring a lot of social cohesion into the communities so that services and programs are both shared together.
Then let's drill that a bit more. Let's just drill on that a bit more. So there are some concerns that take almost immediate to handle. If you say, okay, we'd like to have a group of young refugees whom we can take to a certain place and express their voices, that's almost immediate. We can have a group of people, but when we talk about assimilating them into the economy or refugee status, that takes a bit longer, even though there have been systems in practice for years and years. What is the holdup? And feel free to be as candid as possible. Yeah. What's been your experience with where that pain point is that we don't seem to understand from outside?
To be honest, I think, let me start by saying that we experience what I would call ingenuine welcome for our own people. The system is crafted in a way that makes refugees to be dependent on aid.
Okay.
When you put refugees in a camp for 30 years, mindset-wise, psychologically, I think it's a big thing that affects their mental state. And for me, I mean, I would be very blunt to say that I've been a refugee for more than 20 years in Kenya. And what that means is that you have what you'd call hopeless hope.
Okay.
So if you don't have a documentation, you cannot access anything virtually. But I think the bigger question really is that why does the system categorize you as less of a human being, whereas there's so much you can contribute in that country?
You've really alluded to, I think, a fantastic segue on policy and national mandates.
Yeah.
You've lent your mind and your perspective to different organizations and, of course, within this conversation on what's happening within different countries, one of which is in Kenya with the Sharika plan, for example. What are some of the gaps that keep reappearing? Anytime you make some bit of progress, you have to go back a few steps and then keep moving forward. So just help us understand what your experience has been with the Sharika plan and where we are and what we should be looking forward to.
Yeah, so the Sharika plan is a very transformative plan, as the government says, to change the refugee camps into settlements. So ideally to have a situation where refugees are able to socially and economically be included into national system. But then the part of that is how host communities can also benefit from refugee programs and vice versa to that degree. I think the biggest bottleneck that we still find until now is that there's, of course, the funding question that's going to come up for how do you implement some of these things, because they need some level of systemic restructuring. And I'll tell you... I
like that you've said systemic again.
Yeah, and I'll say this why. Because there's a very specific challenge we have in Kenya. The refugee database and the Kenyan database does not speak to each other.
Okay.
So you find that you might be having a refugee ID. If you go to KRA today, or the Kenya Refugee Revenue Authority, you cannot get your document there. So it means that you cannot be able to apply for your tax PIN, your e-citizen, your driving license, and all these things. These are systemic issues that, if not addressed, even Sharika plan will not be able to bring the solution that it's trying to bring. So that has to be addressed. And it goes back to the implementation.
I just have two questions for you. One of the things is, we have a lot of convenings that can actually move the needle on a lot of things.
Correct.
Do you feel like people listen more on the continent or outside the continent? Because there are very different agendas, right? And I know it's a very tricky question because it kind of puts you in a tight spot. But I'd like to know, when you get into these forums anywhere around the world, are people actually listening? And where have you seen people listen and actually move to action?
Well, I mean, you will tempt me to say internationally, because there's much more facing of whoever says what. So there's always that question of, if I say something at the international level, this is something that is binding us as a country or as a people, whoever is saying it. Yeah. So there's some level, I mean, even when you talk about participation, it actually has moved much more in the international space. I'll tell you, In 2019, when there was the first Global Refugee Forum, there's only 72 refugees that attended that out of 4,000 people. In 2023, when we had the second Global Refugee Forum, we had a whopping 324 refugees that attended. So it's an increase from 72 to 324. In terms of refugee advisors, we had none in 2019. We had at least 14 in different, 14 states. And this is, of course, with the works that we're doing. But I think I see a lot of, there's movements at the international level, but I think the biggest movement in terms of those discussions, I think it's the discussion we have at country level and regional level. How does those discussions international level, but also even our own discussion down here, push the needle much more further in terms of refugee inclusion? But just for example, the Africa Leadership Forum, I see more genuine approach towards solving the question of Africans and refugees being part of that. And if there's more push to that idea of engagement, I think we're going to be able to receive a moment where we're actually saying as Africans, we're being able to find a solution for our people. And I think that's not the same way you'd see it with, for example, in the international. It takes a lot of steps. So I'll say that there's much more listening in the international level because of the obligations, the commitments that these countries do and NGOs. But I think the greatest conversation to move the needle is conversations like the ALF and many others that we need to have in the region.
Let's now shift gears and welcome Michael Adeneu, Country Director of Oxford Policy Management in Ethiopia, to discuss the crucial balance between development and policy, followed by insights from Dr. Karabo Tokwane, Director of Clinical Services at the Ministry of Health in Botswana, on strengthening health systems.
We've been interrogating what collaboration with different stakeholders in the ecosystem look like. One thing that we run the risk of, especially with a younger population that's getting into leadership, and then leadership trying to solve for a different generation, for example, is the lack of commonality on what development looks like. Have you understood what that commonality looks like?
It's an interesting question. There's always going to be, and that's always been the case, where generation difference have got different perspective. But tackling important issues like this would require both the contribution of the youth, which would be able to be impacted by the decisions that's been made, but also old and wise people who've got the experience. Now, I think the discussions have been, there is what it seems to be a disconnect, but not always. Having that wide perspective would only going to enrich and be able to solve the problem in a much better way. So my take is, even though there seems to be a challenge on different perspective, but the end goal would be the same. For older generation, the interest in being able to live a much more prosperous, safe, and hospitable environment is the end game that would be championed by both. So I don't necessarily see it as being a difference.
Okay. You had the conversation on environment and sustainability earlier.
Yes.
And I know within your space, technology has been, front and center.
Yes.
But there's the risk of inequality as we continue to advance technologically on the continent. But you're tackling that, at least trying from root till the highest level person in policy. Just explain to us how that progress has been.
The role of technology, especially in the space of climate change and adaptation, have been significant. For example, some of the works that we've been doing, there is always a time lag between getting the right information for policy and mitigate the circumstances before they happen. Now, advances looking into the policy realm, generating the evidence have been now been supported by technology. For example, using remote sensing satellite technologies. We have the capability and capacity being able to predict in much more accurate manner into the future or what to come. For example, leveraging weather patterns and small area estimation, underlining statistical data, we've managed to see events before they happen. This is a new capability which has not been there, which means policymakers now can be able to influence decisions and be able to have a proactive engagement, being able to address some of the challenges that we face.
All right. Final question. You've alluded to the policymaker, but we'd like to tackle the other side, the young people. They form a very crucial part of what happens next. But whenever we mention young people within certain forums, it always feels like, okay, that young person who's maybe not completed school, just right about finishing school, has no job experience. So that's where the mind shifts, and we've heard it from a few people. But there's some people doing phenomenal work who just happen to be young. We just want to know where the space is, even within what you've mapped as OPM, Oxford Policy Management, where the space for young people is before they come knocking down those doors.
It's an interesting question. I have to admit, there is a lot that needs to happen, especially in the continent. The continent average age is about 17.5 years old, which means not only at the latter end of the segment, which have got little or no experience, but there are, as you've said, an amazing young talented individuals that are really creating a significant change across the board that is also looking to make a difference in much broader sense. So how we would be able to see and engage youth would evolve. Some countries better than others have got an intentional mechanism that has the necessary process that would be able to capture the youth voice, not only be able to inform policy, but to drive it as well.
Right.
When it comes into OPM in particular, it's a mixed culture that we have. So we value, one thing I think it's well to know, even though we came out of Oxford University about 47 years ago or so, two-thirds of our workforce resides in the local countries that we operate. And growingly, substantially, we value and be able to understand the local context. So if you take the office in Ethiopia in particular, where I sit in, there is a diverse group of people from a diverse walk of life. We have very senior individuals who got 40 years experience,
Right.
and young, upcoming, influential consultant who are doing a great job as well. There is room for all, and we should be able to be intentional, making sure that it's reflected.
Right. Are we able to summarize the role of academia in development of Ethiopia or the region?
I've tried to allude to this in the panel in generally as a reflection that academia have got a major role to play. But research for academia would always look into creating that knowledge base that is unique and that can contribute to our understanding of the issue. But in the realms of policy, we have to be able to articulate what is happening, why is it happening, but also, most importantly, how we'll be able to solve the issues. So there is a role for academia. There's definitely a role for practitioners. There is a role for civil societies. And there is a role for youth engagement and the like. All work that we do across the board would have to take into account all contribution from all society and walk of life. So this is not to say there is a strong role for academia and research, but also understanding the public sector and its requirement, and be able to clearly outline and translate what needs to be done is, I think, an area that requires further work on this space.
We've been seeing a lot of young women in Botswana getting into leadership. Just let's start there. Is that by design? What's happening that other countries should serve as best practice for other countries?
Botswana is signatory to the SADC Protocol on Gender, as well as the Beijing Declaration. So we take gender very seriously. And the portfolio of gender has actually been elevated to a ministerial portfolio. So I think it's a huge development that actually brings a light to gender issues, especially leadership. However, having said that, in terms of whether we get women and especially young women getting into leadership position because it's an affirmative action, the answer would have to be no.
Okay.
No, it's purely based on merit. The spaces are very competitive, and I'd like to say women in Botswana and the young girls are quite competitive. I'll even give an example of my 10-year-old. When this year started, she said, I want to be top of my class. So they're growing with that mentality that, I have to excel. When I was growing up, it was actually quite common to think that the boy in the class has to be first in class. But then as you grow up, you start asking yourself, but why? And why can't I do it? Because I can do what he can do, so why not? So I think with the mindset change that women are having and the acceptance that the men are having, it actually creates an enabling environment. Is everything perfect? No. Everything is not perfect, because as we have more empowered women, we also need to empower the men on how to coexist with those empowered women, because it's not every man that can coexist with empowered women. We are still a very traditional nation, so culture still plays a role in terms of traditional gender roles, such that as a woman, even if you advise, if you hold a higher position than a man, they might view it as you challenging their authority at home. So as we have women being in leadership roles and them being more empowered, we also need to empower the men so that they're able to coexist with these empowered women.
Nice. Right, I like that that's the starting point of our conversation. Now let's go to another conversation that has now come up, but we love that it's taking center stage, mental health. Within the aspect of leadership, the older generation or generations that came before us, mental health was not something that was even discussed, let alone on the agenda, on a leadership forum program. So how has that been for you, especially understanding how clear it is for us to discuss, but then telling the leaders, oh, think about this too. With everything else, add this.
Yes. So for me, it goes back to culture. Culturally, they say you strike a woman, you strike a rock, because we are supposed to be very, very strong. And it's something similar for the men as well. Mental health was something that was not acknowledged. It was seen as weakness. But now, I think with health promotion, we are giving everyone permission to say, I am not feeling well. And we're saying, it's okay to not be okay. And I believe that it's having those conversations that unlocks those taboo areas that traditionally we could not talk about. And sometimes you also have to show the leadership the advantages of going into those taboo conversations, because what you stand to gain is a lot more than what you stand to lose. Or if you were not to have the conversation and things keep on going the way they are going right now. Mental health is expensive. The effects of mental health are expensive. And if you are able to demonstrate that if someone is not feeling well, if someone is depressed, if someone has a psychotic break, what does it mean? It means time away from work. And time away from work means loss of income. And loss of income means you can't pay school fees for your kids. Like, there's such a huge ripple effect. And if we don't have those conversations, and if we don't demonstrate those things, then it becomes very hard for people to understand. But I am liking that. I think Gen Alpha and Gen Z, they are, in my language, what we call sekhatlamela masisi. They break down barriers, they break glass doors. Sekhatlamela masisi. So they don't knock. Or if they knock, they will knock once and then they will go in. So they force you to actually stand up and listen. The way we used to do things and the way that things used to be done by those who came before us, it does not work for them. And unlike our generation, where we were very apologetic in our needs and the needs of our society, they are not apologetic. They are saying, oh, there's no chair for me. I am coming, I am creating a table, I am bringing the chair, and I am inviting you to my table, not coming to your table. So I believe that them holding us to a higher account as a sector and holding the leadership to a higher account is what has brought a lot of these developments. And it's like paying it forward. It's like a ripple effect.
Right.
It starts from one place and it just spreads. And you know, grandparents always want to make their grandkids happy. It's very important to understand that health is not just about health. It is so multifaceted. Health comes at the tail end of something not going right in other sectors. Whether it's food insecurity, then you get malnutrition. Whether it's climate change and you get floods and you have bloodborne diseases. So if we work on all these other sectors, then the job for us as the health sector is very, very minimal because we are the end result of what is happening in other sectors. So if people, or if sectors were to actually measure how they are performing, they should actually look at the health sector.
And then it becomes less of a financial conversation. It's more of a down the line and ecosystem conversation.
Exactly, exactly.
Advice for young Africans who are looking to get into leadership?
The first thing I'd have to say is be bold, be courageous, and in everything that you do, do the right thing. And lastly, being allowed to serve is a privilege. When you are in leadership, you are in a position of power. But do not think that power belongs to you. You only have that power because the people have given you the permission and the platform and the opportunity to serve them. So your power only comes from the people being kind enough to allow you to serve them.
Now, as we close, we ask the leaders we've spoken to today for one word of advice that young people hoping to get into leadership would benefit from.
I find it really encouraging when I see youth participating in these conversations, but we need to move a step further and allow for space for these young people to now start serving in important leadership roles, both in government and in business.
Please be honest. Please be patriotic. Don't just mouth patriotism while you're doing self-serving maneuvers in the country. The country needs you for them, not for you.
It's very important to understand that health is not just about health. It is so multifaceted. Health comes at the tail end of something not going right in other sectors.
I see more genuine approach towards solving the question of Africans and refugees being part of that. And if there's more push to that idea of engagement, I think we're going to be able to receive a moment where we're actually saying as Africans, we're being able to find a solution for our people.
Research for academia would always look into creating that knowledge base that is unique and that can contribute to our understanding of the issue. But in the realms of policy, we have to be able to articulate what is happening, why is it happening, but also, most importantly, how we'll be able to solve the issues.
That's all from us here at State of Africa. Absolutely brilliant perspectives and words of encouragement from different leaders at the Africa Leadership Forum in Uganda. My name is George Ndirango. Be sure to stay in touch and give us your feedback on the Africa Leadership and Dialogue Institute's social media pages. And until next time, thanks for tuning in.